Hello, dear friends. I am talking from Bar Ilan, from teacher's room. Um, I'd like to go over something I said Shabbat, the Shabbat right before Purim. And I call it three things that we can learn about Megillat Esther, about the scroll of Esther. The first one is that the scroll of Esther, there's always this question, is it a story? Is it a historical document? So let me put it this way, whichever way you want to describe it, it's definitely based, whoever wrote Megillat Esther, according to our tradition, is Mordechai and Esther, but whoever wrote it was very familiar with Persian culture of the time, which already puts it into historical context. Let me give you some examples. First of all, the fact that in Achashverosh, who might be Xerxes the First, of course, according to the Septuagint, it's Artaxerxes, but it seems to be more applicable to Xerxes, especially since there's another word for Artaxerxes in the book of Nehemiah, Artaxasta. But you have these letters that are sent to the various nations or the various nations who are under the control of Achashverosh, 127 states, in their language, and they're able to keep their language and their culture, which is very appropriate for the Persian Empire. That's exactly what they did, as long as you knew who was the boss, whoever the king was at the time. So they were very tolerant of the cultures that were under them. Another thing, which is very appropriate for the Persian Empire, is the position of women. Because you have two things to the women. Of course, in antiquity, women are sort of subservient to the men. But in the Persian Empire, you have this idea of the feminine mystique, the power of women. We have two books in the Bible that are in the names of a woman. The title of the book of Ruth, of course, according to our tradition, it was written by the prophet Samuel, and the book of Esther, which according to our tradition, or probably according to the at least the narrative of Megillat Esther, was written by Mordechai and sanctioned by Esther. And Esther also writes this letter to make sure that the Purim holiday will be eternalized in the Jewish calendar. According to the Talmud, she also writes to the rabbis to make sure that this would happen. Kitvuni lidorot, right, mean done for generations. Now, this idea of a book in the name of a woman and the main hero of the book being a woman is very, very appropriate for the Persian Empire, especially the way it is. Let me give you an example. We have another book that's written during the Persian Empire. It's called the Book of Judith. It's not part of the Hebrew Bible. It's part of what's referred to as the Apocrypha, the Sfarim HaChitzonim. There are other Bibles, like the Vulgata, which use the Book of Judith or as part of the canon of the biblical text. And other books that are found in certain Christian denominations would be Judith and Jubilees, Maccabees 1 and Tobias. These books would be found there. And for Jews, they are important texts historically, but not wholly writ. But in the book of Judith, which is also from the Persian Empire, you have Judith who is able to seduce Holofernes, the general, and then kill him in the tent, exactly like Yael did in the book of Judges. So she turns to this femme fatale, the idea of the quiet, docile, passive woman who becomes this vengeful animal against the enemy. Now, when we think of a femme fatale, we think of manipulating somebody for self-interest. But the examples I'm going to give are manipulating the enemy to rid ourselves of the enemy. So Judith is for sure an example of this. And Esther, of course, is an example of this too. Remember, Esther is this passive, docile woman who didn't want to go to the beauty contest of Achashverosh, but was pushed. It says, Vatila kach, she was taken against her will in chapter 2, and she's sort of forced, and she doesn't ask for anything from the cosmetics or the beauty treatments, only what is forced upon her by Haggai, the servant of the king. And then she's picked. That the whole time she's this passive woman doing very little. Mordecai tells her not to tell which people she's from, which he does. And then in chapter 4, when Mordecai hears that Haman passed a decree sealed by the king to rid the Persian Empire of Jews and to let anybody fight the Jews who wants to, he goes to Esther's palace with a sackcloth, says to Esther, and if you think that you can hide in the king's palace at a time like this, salvation shall come to the Jewish people from another place, and you and your father's house will be destroyed. Very hard words, very harsh words. Esther hears this. She listens, and then right away, she starts to move into first gear of action. She says, first of all the Jews in Shushan have to fast for 3 days, and I will do that together with my servants. And then she develops a plan. This passive woman all of a sudden becomes a fighting animal for her people. And she goes out to see the king to risk her life. And then she manipulates the king and manipulates Haman and manipulates the king to think that Haman has something against her. And then finally Haman is hanged. And then she requests for his sons to be hanged another day too, in addition to being hanged for the first time. And she asks the king that the Jews be able to have a decree to defend themselves. And when the Jews defend themselves and kill their enemies, she asks for another day in the city of Shushan. And then the king gives her the house of Haman, and she gives it over to Mordecai. Whoa, this woman all of a sudden takes action and becomes totally outgoing like we have never seen it happen before. It's like all of a sudden she turns into this femme fatale, killing the enemy. And whoop, whoop, whoop. Perfect example of the feminine mystique in the Persian culture. Tell you another story. In Josephus Flavius, in his Antiquities, when he is talking about the Second Temple period, and in the Second Temple period, according to the book of Ezra, Zerubbabel from the tribe of Judah is appointed to be the head governor of Judea. And how did this happen that Cyrus, Koresh, picked Zerubbabel? So Josephus tells us a story which is not in the Bible. And the story goes that Cyrus decides to make a party for all his aristocracy. And at the party, he plays a game. He says, who can tell me what the most powerful thing in the kingdom is? Well, a lot of the people attending want to play the game. One of them says, this thing is like money, and another says military, and different possibilities of what can be the most powerful thing. And then he says, well, Zerubbabel, what do you say? And Zerubbabel says, I'll tell you what the most powerful thing in the kingdom is. It's a woman. There's a sort of a hush. Everybody's wondering. Says, let me explain, says Zerubbabel. You, Cyrus, are the greatest of kings. You are the king of kings on this planet, and you have a mighty army, and you are revered all over the globe. And you, Cyrus, where did you come from, if not from the womb of a woman? So everybody hears that, and they start to clap. And Cyrus says, okay, you won the contest. So tell me, Zerubbabel, what would you request? Zerubbabel says, our temple's been destroyed. Jerusalem is in sackcloth. Maybe you can send me there to try to do something. And then Cyrus gives his edict and allows the Jews to go back to Judea, build Jerusalem, and build God's temple. But this idea of the woman is the most powerful thing. These women who, on the average, they unfortunately are just almost objects owned by their husbands, but there are the women who have the ability to have this power to overcome all men if necessary. So the Persians were quite believers in this feminine mystique, something the Greeks were not. The Greeks were slightly misogynist. They didn't take their women, I guess, that seriously. And it's interesting that in Maccabees 2, second book of Maccabees, when it talks about Purim, it refers to the scroll of Esther as the scroll of Mordechai, the book of Mordechai. Interesting, from the Greek period. So I just wanted to point that out. So that's part one. And part one is that everything about the Esther story fits like a glove to the Persian Empire. Also, all the words, the Persian words. There are scores of Persian words in the book of Esther. First of all, the name of our holiday, Purim. which means a lottery in Persian. Esther's name, Esther, which is a star, of course. It's also like Ashtar, the Babylonian god. Mordechai, Morduk, another Babylonian god. And then the names of the various people. So you have Haman, which the name Haman is actually the pure thought, which is one of the names of the Zoroastrian pantheon, according to Dr. Tamar Gindin, who does research on Persian culture. And Vashti, which means the best in Persian, which is also play on words, and etc. And you have all the 7 Ro'ei Pnei HaMelech, those who are sitting in the king's advisors. Out of the 7 of them in chapter 1, 6 of them have to do with the Zoroastrian pantheon. So whoever is writing the book of Esther is assuming that the reader understands Farsi, or else they wouldn't understand that all these names have to do with the Persian Empire, the names of the people in the scroll. So that's number one, that it's definitely written during the Persian Empire by somebody who knows the Persian Empire, who even assumes that the readers know something about the Persian Empire and the Farsi language, which is interesting. That's part one. So even if there are things in the Megillah where things are changed around, because we know that, for instance, Esther, her Hebrew name was Hadassah, which means a myrtle branch. If anything, Esther was her Persian name, maybe given to her even by the king. But we know that. That's what Jews do when they're in the Galut, when they're diaspora. They have double names. Their name could be Robert, but their Hebrew name is Reuven. Their name could be Susan, but their Hebrew name is Shoshana. We're familiar with things like this. The double identity of the Jew outside of Israel, very often because of fear of anti-Semitism. So part number one, even by the way, the Babylonian names of the months, which is mentioned for the first time in the book of Esther, also in Nehemiah, Daniel, and which is also about, not far away, almost the same time. So, and these, according to the Talmud, the reason why we today use these Babylonian names of Tishrei and Cheshvan is not to forget the Babylonian exile, which was the paradigm of exile, was the first exile. So that's point number one. Point number two, and I just ended off with point number two. Point number two is that Megillat Esther, the Scroll of Esther, is a book about Jews in the exile. And is a paradigm of Jews in the exile because it is the first exile, the Babylonian exile, which the Persians conquered the Babylonian Empire, and now becomes the Persian Empire. So that is factor number two. And because of this, there are hints and metaphors and almost parodies in the book of Esther describing the Jew in the exile. As I said, the double name, which I just mentioned now, Esther is Hadassah. Mordechai, we don't even know his Hebrew name, but he probably had one. The names of the months with the Babylonian gods, but we take it with us not forget this dual personality. And the fact that God's name is not mentioned at all in the book of Esther, because in the Galut, we are in a point of time where there's no prophecy and where it's God hides his countenance. It's as if the face of God is covered and God can only work behind the scenes, behind the curtains. Now we have 2 books in the Bible where the name of God is not mentioned. One is the Song of Songs attributed to King Solomon, and the other one is Esther. Now the Song of Songs was always understood as a parable. And therefore, for that reason, a mashal, so it was, I guess people understood if it's a parable, it doesn't necessarily have to have God's name. On the other hand, the book of Esther is not written exactly as a parable. When we look in the apocryphal literature of the Second Temple period, there is a book called Additions to Esther. In these additions to Esther, Tosfot leMegillat Esther, you have major additions to chapter 4, where Mordechai goes over to Esther. And in these additions, Mordechai is praying, and Esther is praying, and Mordechai is praying, and Esther is praying. In other words, all the things that bothered the Jews in the Second Temple period, that the document looked too secular. So they had to fine-tune it and make everybody start praying. Because things in the Megillah, which should be religious with religious overtones, are not. Number one, in chapter 4, two things in chapter 4. When Mordecai says, if you're going to hide in the king's palace at this time, salvation shall come to the Jewish people from another place. What's the other place? Why can't he say from God? Or God has many emissaries? It's almost like he's not allowed to say it because this is the Jew in the exile. And even when Esther answers him, what does she say? Okay, tell all the Jews in Susa and Shushan to fast day and night for 3 days with me. Why are you fasting? What's the point of fasting if you're not praying to God? It doesn't say pray to God. We usually understand fasting is going together with prayer. But if it's just fasting by itself, so what is this, an intermittent fasting health idea? Again, something's missing from the narrative, and you can feel it, as if the Megillah does not want to mention God's name, because this is the Jew in the Galut. And the third thing, one other thing about the Jew in the Galut, which is very important to say. Cyrus is the first king of Persia. Cyrus is the one who made his proclamation in the book of Ezra and at the end of Chronicles 2, that the Jews can go back to Judea, build up Jerusalem and their temple. And it was, as we know from the book of Ezra, very few Jews decided to take him up on that. The names are actually listed in the book of Ezra, the heads of the families, to show how important these people were, that they actually made the move. But the majority of Jews stayed back. Now, the Esther story, doesn't matter under which Persian king it is, it's after the decree, because it's not Cyrus. So whether it's Xerxes I, Artaxerxes I, Xerxes II, but it's probably Xerxes I, it's after the proclamation of Cyrus. So we're talking about a Jewish community in the exile who volunteered to remain in the exile and not go up to Judea. You could say, okay, this is not too long after the proclamation. Things were very hard in Judea. They were waiting to see what's going to happen, maybe, but it should be kept in mind. These are Jews who voluntarily decided to remain in the diaspora, in the exile. And maybe that's another reason why the Megillah is being a little bit harsh with them in some of the overtones of the Megillah. And one last point, and that is, what is really going on in Megillat Esther? In Hebrew, the scroll of Esther, we say Megillat, which means the scroll, Megillah, Esther, her name. But it could also be understood as coming from a different word. Megillat is also the root legalot, which means to reveal. Esther, which is a Persian word, in Hebrew has the word seter, which means hidden. So if you put the two things together, it's to reveal the hidden. Legalot et seter, Megillat Esther. And what is hidden? What is hidden in Megillat Esther is God's name. God hides his countenance. As the prophet said, Achena ta'el mistater Elohei Yisrael Moshiach. Definitely you are a God who hides. The God of Israel gives salvation. So even when God hides, God gives salvation. But you have to be active. You have to prove the point. You have to do the fast. You have to do the initiatives. And you have to beseech God to help. And even in the diaspora, even when God hides, salvation can come to the Jewish people, even at a time like that. So it's Megillat Esther. The Talmud says, in a very funny way, it's a funny question, where is Esther mentioned in the 5 books of Moses? Now, why should Esther be in the Pentateuch? She's not in the Pentateuch. She's much later. But they bring a verse from Deuteronomy 28, which is talking about the exile, or referring to the punishment of the Jews leaving the land, that the punishment that could happen. And this is appropriate because it's the exile. On that day, I will hide my countenance. Aster, to hide. Esther, to hide. So exactly what I said. And then the Talmud has another funny question. Haman, where is he mentioned in the Pentateuch? Also a funny question. And the answer is, Hamina eitz asher amartecha lo le'echol mimeno achalta? Did you eat from the tree that I told you not to eat from? Meaning the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? Hamin, Rum. Did you eat from that tree? Haman, therefore, if Esther represents that God hides his countenance in the exile, Haman represents the tree of knowledge of good and evil, which means the evil in our world, the possibility of evil in our world. And what is that possibility of evil? It's the way you look at the world. The world is not good, it's not evil, it's what you choose. But Haman draws lots, the poor. And the name of the holiday is Purim because of the lottery. A lottery means looking at this world as a place of chance, where there's no divine providence, where there's no meaning and no plans. Everything is by chance. Whatever you do, just do, because everything is by chance. That is the belief of Haman. And it's Esther and Mordechai who believe that God helps from beyond the scenes. And this is the decision that a person must make, how you look at the world. Is it a world of chance, void of meaning, where kol dalim gavar, whoever is stronger is the one who makes it to the top? Or is there meaning, and is there ethics, and is there meaning to human life, and a teleology, some organized pattern behind things, and a God in control, which is the belief of Esther and Mordechai. Shalom, shalom. Oh, one last thing. I'm sorry. We have a tradition on Purim. The tradition, which is much later, because most of our traditions of Purim are actually mentioned in the Megillah. The idea of giving alms to the poor, the idea of giving two different types of food as presents to our friends. It's all mentioned in the Megillah in chapter 8. And it even says the idea of having a feast and drinking. But the Talmud has a strange thing. There's one mention in the Talmud, it becomes an argument, whether a person should get drunk on Purim. Should they get, Rava says you should get as drunk until adelo yada, until you don't know the difference between blessing Mordechai and cursing Haman. What does that mean? And there in Jewish law, there's a discussion, you really have to get drunk, you just have to drink a little bit more. And people understand this as a metaphor. The Hasidic world explains the metaphor like this. What does it mean, ad lo yada, until you don't know? The Jew living in the Galut, when we look at the world in a rational way, it's hard to know. Maybe the world is by chance. It just seems, or maybe it's just natural systems. By looking in the natural world, I can't necessarily reach God through logic. But it says ad lo yada, which means, what does it mean to be drunk? To be drunk means that my logic is not working anymore. To find God in this world, you don't have to get drunk, but you have to realize that you might have to circumvent logic. You might have to sense God and not prove God necessarily. Because in our tradition, belief in God is not belief that, it is belief in, it is a relationship. My friend and teacher, Professor Moshe Idel, once said that how come monotheism, which we claim as Jews to have brought to the world, why is it a Greek word? And there's no Hebrew equivalent for monotheism. You can say in a few words the belief in one God, emunah b'el echad. There's no one word. Because as Jews, for us, monotheism is a relationship with God. And as we know in relationships, it's only when the relationship goes sour that you have to talk about it. When the relationship is vibrant, you don't have to talk about it, you're in it. So the relationship to God is not necessarily through logic. It's through intuition, it's through sense, it's through feeling the relationship in your life, in your world. Shalom, shalom.